Hi there and welcome to The History Teacher. This revision video covers superpower relations and the Cold War, 1941 to 1991, from the GCSE Edexcel 9-1 course. Hopefully you'll also find it useful if you're studying any of the other exam boards, or if, like me, you just love history. You can now become a member to support me to continue to make this content. You'll get exclusive access to worksheets, revision materials, and you'll get to vote on forthcoming episodes. Just click on the join button below this video. Hi there guys, you will remember that the location of Berlin is important to the development of the Cold War. It meant that the West maintained a foothold in the Soviet-controlled East Germany. Throughout the 1950s, West Germany had prospered due to receiving Marshall aid from the USA and the introduction of the new currency. Most people, as a result, had a reasonably high standard of living. Meanwhile, the East received little funding from the USSR. The economic policies of the 1950s had led to shortages of basics such as food and medicines. Additionally, Soviet control of the government was extremely unpopular. The Soviet forces had committed atrocities, including rape and murder, when liberating Berlin from the Nazis. Then, the Soviet government placed restrictions on what people could say and do, using the secret police to monitor people's behaviour. In 1953, there were riots against the government, which was so bad that the authorities needed to send in an armed force to deal with it. It was very easy to leave the East. One could simply travel from East to West Berlin, and from there travel freely to West Germany. Since the quality of life was so much higher in the West, people left in their droves. Between 1949 and 61, it is estimated that 2.7 million people left the East and started a new life in the West. Skilled workers and professionals especially left the East. Engineers, teachers, doctors and technicians were aware that they could earn much higher wages in the West, and so they left in their millions, and this is nicknamed the brain drain. The brain drain was a propaganda disaster for the USSR. All the world could see that people, especially educated people, preferred the West to the East. Khrushchev decided the solution was to make West Berlin part of East Germany, thereby shutting down the route to the West and stopping the flood of people. Khrushchev's first step was to demand that the West recognise the existence of East Germany. The Western countries had refused to accept that Germany could not be reunited, but Khrushchev wanted to force them to accept the permanent division. Then, on the 27th of November 1958, Khrushchev issued his ultimatum. He gave the West 6 months to demilitarise and withdraw from Berlin, and declare Berlin a free city with its own independent government. However, Khrushchev had no intention of keeping Berlin free. He wanted it to be controlled by the USSR. He said that if the West did not give up Berlin within 6 months, he would hand over control of the routes into Berlin from the West to the East German government. This was a clever plan because it would mean that the West would have to work with the East German government to deliver supplies to Berlin, essentially forcing them to acknowledge East Germany as a legitimate country. The West were outraged by Khrushchev's ultimatum. The USA saw this as another example of the USSR trying to spread communism. However, Khrushchev believed he had no choice but to try and stop the brain drain. You will also remember that both sides wanted to avoid a war due to the threat of MAD, mutually assured destruction. So, between 1959 and 1961, a series of talks were held with the aim of solving the Berlin problem. The first was held in Geneva in Switzerland in May 1959. However, no agreement was reached, and so the President of the USA, Eisenhower, invited the Russians to the USA to continue the talks. Eisenhower and Khrushchev met face to face for the very first time. The talks took place at the residential ranch Camp David in September 1959. This was the first ever visit by a leader of the USSR to the USA, and Khrushchev did all the tourist activities of a trip to the States. However, despite all of this, he did not withdraw the Berlin Ultimatum, and again the meeting ended without agreement. Further talks were booked in for May 1960 in Paris. However, before the talks could take place, a U-2 spy plane was shot down over the USSR on the 1st of May. The Soviets captured the pilot, Gary Powers, who admitted to being a spy despite the USA's claims the plane was collecting weather data and had been blown off course. The USA refused to apologise. Khrushchev was furious and stormed out of the Paris talks. One more attempt was made to come to an agreement. The USA had elected a new young president, John F. Kennedy, who was inaugurated in January 1961. Kennedy attended his first set of talks with Khrushchev in Vienna, Austria in June 1961. His attitude going into the talks was to try and continue talks with the USSR, but he was at the same time building up his troops. Khrushchev, on the other hand, thought Kennedy was too young and inexperienced, and Kennedy's embarrassment over the Bay of Pigs, which we're going to cover in a different video, did nothing to dispel his belief. And so, Khrushchev attended the talks in Vienna with a determination to get his own way, starting with the Berlin Ultimatum. Kennedy's response was to refuse to negotiate. He was worried about seeming weak and so refused to make any concessions. Unsurprisingly, the meeting ended without a decision. Kennedy returned to the USA and began to build up the USA's armed forces, spending over $2 billion. It was clear that Kennedy was willing to make a fight of it. Khrushchev, on the other hand, returned to the USSR and began the preparations to build the Berlin Wall. Okay, that's everything you need to know about the Berlin Ultimatum. Thank you for joining me. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more history content and visit my website to become a member and gain access to worksheets, revision materials, and to vote on future episodes. Keep learning and I will see you next time.